All right, let's begin with the big story this evening. We're talking about the moves the government has taken over the weekend to fight inflation. Some duties have been cut, but the major move was the reduction in excise duty on petrol by 8 rupees per litre and on diesel by 6 rupees per litre. The Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman later clarified that this has come out of the additional excise duty component, which is basically the road cess, and hence is not the portion that is shared with the states. It's not the portion of tax that is shared with the states. The cut in excise duty on fuel will have a revenue implication of almost 1 lakh crore rupees in a year, which the central government will bear. But it also puts the ball in the states' court that have to now follow suit with cuts in VAT. Now, a couple of states have announced that they have cut VAT, but really, to what extent, how much it's going to help is something we're going to be discussing now with Dr. K.V Subramanian, former Chief Economic Advisor. Dr. Subramanian, great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for speaking with us. All right, let me begin with the measures that were announced on Saturday. Some would say that it's a little and it's a bit late. A lot more can be done. Do you think that we need more at this point, or are you happy with the extent of cuts we have, in as it will make a real impact on inflation?
Thank you very much, Tamanna, and a very good evening to all the viewers. I think the cut of 8 rupees in petrol and the 6 rupees on diesel is particularly quite useful for the middle class, because unlike the poor who have actually gotten subsidized food and the rich who've been able to save during the COVID because of lower consumption, the middle class, the budgets were getting affected, and this is certainly something that will benefit the middle class. Now, earlier before these announcements, I had mentioned that states and the center need to work in tandem, and states need to follow up on the center's cuts. Do remember, this is the second round of cuts. The earlier cut had happened before Diwali, 5 rupees on petrol and 10 rupees on diesel. So cumulatively now, center therefore has cut the excise duty on petrol by 13 rupees and 16 rupees on diesel. Now, a few clarifications that are very important. You for instance, mentioned that states have cut the VAT by so many. I think here our viewers need to understand very clearly that this is the difference between items that are in the GST versus petrol and diesel, for instance, which are not in the GST, and therefore there is a tax on tax. For instance, before the cut by 8 rupees, the pre-VAT price was about 88, which has been cut to 80. Now, because of the cut from 88 to 80, what that means is that the VAT will basically not be charged on the $8, which is actually a decline. Now, if you do the numbers, for instance, take Maharashtra, which has a VAT rate of 26%. 26% times 8 rupees is basically 2.08, which is exactly what they've announced, as that they announced that they've reduced it. It is actually just an outcome of the center's cut. Similarly, 31% is the VAT rate for Rajasthan. Sure. 8 rupees times 31% is 2.48. Similarly, if you do all the other numbers, it is just an outcome of the reduction, by the center, and because, GST actually is not there on petrol and diesel. So it's just a tax on tax that is reduction. There is no conscious cut by these states. I think that's something.
So let me just get a clarification here, because this is important, Dr. Subramanian, because these states have been saying, their claim is that they have cut rates. Other states are saying they have not cut rates. For example, Tamil Nadu has not cut rates yet and is saying that we shouldn't have to. But extending the argument that you've just explained, Tamil Nadu will willy-nilly also cut rates just by the extent to which excise duty has been cut and the percentage of VAT they charge.
Correct. And that would be true for every state. The 8 rupees decline in, excise duty of petrol times the VAT rate of every state, that will basically be the decline automatically, not because of a conscious decision. I think that's the part that has to be clarified. This is just the impact of tax on tax. So yes, the consumer, for instance, will get a benefit of 10 rupees and 8 paise, because $8 plus the 2.08, this is for Maharashtra, for instance, 2.08 because of the tax on tax, 10.0, and similarly you can do the numbers. So none of these actually are conscious cuts. These are just an outcome of the tax on tax. Second point, which actually I want to mention as well, if you take, for instance, Maharashtra and compare with Gujarat, a neighboring state, if you look at the overall tax per litre that Maharashtra charges, it's 31 rupees per litre. In contrast, Gujarat is 12 rupees per litre. And if we take on average 60 rupees is the tax that, the state plus center charge, that means 50% of the, or a little more than 50% of the tax that the consumer is paying in Maharashtra is coming in from the taxes levied by the state. So it actually is, and this is very important, that consumers and the citizens must recognize that about half actually is the burden is being put by the states themselves actually. So I think this is a case of actually making sure that the talk that is being done is actually walked as well. And I think the communication, viewers should not get misled by some of this communication. It is an automatic outcome. There is no conscious choice, and the burden actually is being equally placed. Therefore, it behooves the states as well to actually respond equally to the cuts that have been done by the center.
So since Dr. Subramanian, you've chosen to wade right into the state versus center political fight, which has been going on since these cuts have been announced, then I must take to you the argument being placed by the states. They're saying we should not cut as much as you because we don't make as much as you. You can tax on everything. We can tax only on fuel and on alcohol. Because of GST, our powers of taxation have been curtailed. All we have are these two items, so it's not the same.
No, Tamanna, let me clarify very clearly, right? I am pointing out the economics here and presenting the facts so that facts can be separated from the narratives by the viewers. That is my job as an economist. Now, specifically to the question that you have asked, let me respond that, the states basically have the decision to, they contribute as part of the GST Council. And when it comes to actually other items, I think the, fuel and alcohol is something that is outside, but states, are definitely part of all the decisions that are taken as part of the GST Council. So I think, a couple of facts that clearly must be remembered so that, the viewers can make out for themselves, who is basically walking the talk and who is not, that the burden of, on paid petrol and diesel is almost equally being placed by the states and the center. And starting from November onwards, center has clearly cut, and some of the states that actually we've been discussing, the outcomes it's just an outcome. There has been no conscious cut. The claim that actually there's been a cut can be made only if the VAT rate, for instance, is cut or there is a subsidy provided. If, for instance, instead of 26%, it is brought down to, let's say, 20%, or a subsidy per litre is provided. That's a conscious choice. This is just a, inevitable outcome of the cut by the center.
Yes, but it comes back to my question. States say they can't afford the largesse that center can.
Well, see, I think, what I was taught was that economics remains the same, and budgets have to be balanced actually, by center and the states or a municipality itself. I don't think economics cherry picks in terms of, which entity we are talking about. So if the states have to balance budget, I think center has to balance the budget as well. So, I mean, as an economist, I actually would not cherry pick arguments and just present these facts before you.
All right. Now, let's come to the impact of this. And this is the important point. I understand the differentiation you've made between what center is doing, what states are doing. Frankly, for the common man, close to 50% of every 100 rupees they pay is taxes. And it's going from their pocket. And I don't think most people really care whether it's to center or state. They just don't want to pay as much. My question is, how much is this going to help? Is it going to have a significant impact? The ballpark figure that economists have been talking about today is 20 to 40 basis points. I mean, surely that's not enough.
No, I think, Tamanna, I must clarify that the reason, these facts are being presented is that, if, for instance, the cut by the center is doubled down by the states as well, then the consumer indeed benefits. And if, in a democracy, therefore, citizens have to be aware of the facts. So yes, of course, the consumer is basically caring only about the eventual price. But when the eventual price is the sum of taxes, almost equal by state and center, then I think it behooves for basically both of them to take equal responsibility. That's the point I'm mentioning. I think second, which we clearly have talked about as well, that budgets need to be balanced across, both states and center. When COVID came, I think, center had to actually do a lot of heavy lifting as well, to ensure subsidies were provided, and states had to do their share as well. So I think, the economics remains the same across the entities that we talk about.
No, but so a couple of things here, just to take that argument further. The rate at which, or the pace at which, the central government has increased the excise duties, and some of them are additional excise duties which are not shared with the state. That was pretty steep during the pandemic years because there were no other or fewer sources of alternate income. Today, one of the calls being made is, let's go back to those pre-pandemic levels on excise duty, and then we'll talk.
I think that is part of already what has happened, right? I mean, it's moving clearly in that direction, and significant a change. Do remember actually that in the COVID times, crude oil price was almost actually at $35 to $38, actually, so it was about $40. Now, in contrast, actually, we're looking at crude oil prices that are much higher. So I think that's the other part that has to be kept in mind too, when we think about it, because the taxes that are charged by the state are ad valorem, and therefore when crude oil prices increase, the taxes that these states accrue is actually higher because they're actually charging on a higher base. Right, so this is, in some sense, in contrast, the center's excise duty is fixed. So these are all aspects that we have to keep in mind. Make sure that we look at it in a complete manner, so that we are not misled by selective communication.
Okay, the larger point of what more. What more can be done? Is there scope to do a lot more? We've reported today, and I mentioned that in the headlines, that there is a fear the fiscal deficit target could be missed. We have that issue because not many other revenues for the central government. The global market scenario is not very upbeat. So how much FIIs will come in, FDIs will come in, we don't know. Whether disinvestment will fly as was expected. Are you worried on that front, Dr. Subramanian?
No, but so on the fiscal side itself, I think about 1 lakh crore is the hit for the center, as you were mentioning as well. So I think in terms of what needs to be done, especially on the inflation front, I think it's as clear as daylight that states have to actually double down, because if inflation continues, and I've mentioned many times before as well, even while I was in office, that a lot of inflation in India is actually because of supply side issues. So if, let's say, states double down and actually provide or match equally what center has done, then clearly the middle class, the budget actually will definitely benefit significantly from that. Now, as for the economy going forward, there are a couple of factors that I do want to mention. One, because of China, for instance, going through the lockdown and therefore decline in output, US is likely to maybe in recession or maybe very marginal growth, and maybe similar for Europe as well. These will actually have an impact on demand going down and going forward. Therefore, I would carefully watch. My sense is that because of the decline in demand, some of these globally induced increase in commodity prices that have happened, I think will actually go down because of the demand coming down itself, which may be good news. But I think the other part is that we have to make sure that the monetary policy makers walk the tightrope between growth and inflation, because do remember that the investment is far more sensitive to increases in the benchmark rate.
So what is that tightrope? What is that tightrope? You had the MPC minutes that came out recently where one of the members talked about another 100 basis points of a hike. Is that now expected? It's a given?
Well, I would actually, mention the following calculus that must be kept in mind. If there is actually 100 basis points increase and 100 basis points decrease, the reality is that our banks pass on the increases immediately, while they don't do that, when there is a decline. And, many central bank, RBI governors and deputy governors have talked about that. So when this cycle will end, you will actually be facing higher rates, which will impact investment far more. And unlike unlike in the advanced economies, consumption, and 50% of actually your consumption is food, which is not dependent on loans. People, in India, people don't borrow to eat. They basically borrow to maybe buy a house or maybe, buy a car or a two-wheeler. So it's the consumption of only those that will get impacted. So the impact of the benchmark rate changes on consumption will be far lower than that on investment, and private investment declines actually, or maybe not increase enough, will have an impact on growth as well. That's the point that I'm mentioning, that when thinking about actually the tightening, the policymakers also have to keep in mind the dynamic, which is when the loosening will happen, banks will not pass it enough, and investment actually is far more sensitive to benchmark rate changes than consumption is, which is the reality for India, unlike that in advanced economies. So we have to be careful here not to make sure that we just cut paste from the advanced economies where the realities are different from that in India.
Well, clearly, we have not been doing that. The RBI was first accused of being behind the curve. They've stuck to their guns. And let's see what happens next. But
let me quickly respond, Tamanna. I think that part is actually, I don't agree with that, because unlike the advanced economies actually, which, were very, very imprudent on their fiscal policy, expanded money supply significantly. In contrast, in India, fiscal policy was very prudent and therefore gave ample scope to the Reserve Bank to actually, to sort of continue in a wait and watch mode and not respond. So I think that is something, it does not taking into account the prudence in the fiscal policy, that particular comment.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Subramanian, for joining us on this exclusive conversation as we decipher the impact on the decision which was made on Saturday, where excise duty cuts were made. We're going to be continuing that conversation.